In this video, we're going to be reviewing and to some extent play testing Babolat Synthetic Gut, as you can see here. But before we get started, a little bit of a disclaimer. There's no such thing as the best or the worst string. It's really just what is the best string for you, and that can take quite a bit of sampling. It can take a lot of experimentation, and it's a lot like picking a favorite restaurant or even a favorite movie. You need to have that sample size at the start. Now, for a lot of people, it's not really realistic to spend, you could easily spend a couple $100s in a month trying out all the different strings. And so the point of these videos is to give you some technical information and also then my personal experience. So if you are restringing with me or you're restringing elsewhere, you'll be able to figure out what is the best thing for you to try. And if it works out great, stick with it. If it doesn't, obviously try something different the next time. And so we'll be going through a lot of these videos by putting the string in a full bed and then also doing some hybrid variations. And I'll just give you my experience and maybe who I think these strings would be useful for. So without further ado, let's get into it. So what is synthetic gut? The name itself is kind of a misnomer. At least in the modern day, it's a misnomer because we've had so much string development, specifically with multifilaments, which play a lot closer to gut. At least certain types of those do. So the name synthetic gut, it's kind of misleading, but not exactly, because if you think about the history of string development, synthetic gut plays a lot closer to gut than, say, Kevlar or polyester or even certain types of multifilament. So it's all relative. But another term for synthetic gut is often budget string, house string, or some people will just refer to it as nylon. And that's because synthetic gut, and this is true across the board, centrally in the core, there's just one material, and that is the nylon. And then where you get the differences from the brands has to do with what that nylon is wrapped in. And very rarely, if ever, will a company reveal exactly their secret formula for what they wrap the string in. And that's where you get people saying, okay, Wilson synthetic gut plays very different to Babolat synthetic gut. But for the most part, we can say there are certain characteristics that are consistent across the board. For me personally, the synthetic gut I play with, I don't really care that much. I'm fine with any different brand. Some of you who are more sensitive, you will probably find a brand that you prefer. So the idea would be, let's say you try out a synthetic gut, a multifilament, a polyester, you prefer synthetic gut. At that point, you then would maybe want to try a few different brands of synthetic gut. But here are your generics with this type of string. Positives are it's relatively cheap to buy for a set, $4, $5. The total I charge for this string plus stringing is $20. That's just the flat fee. And so that's fairly affordable, and you could get away with probably doing that every month or every couple of months if the string makes it that long. And here's where we start to get to some of the downsides. Tension, retention, probably the worst of all the materials. Within like 21 days, if you don't play at all and you just have the string sitting there, you will drop tension by roughly 20%. So you string in at 60 pounds, a month later, you're down 20%. And that's without even playing with the string. But the odds of you getting there if you are playing regularly, it's also unlikely because it's the least durable of all the strings. So it will start to break down pretty quickly, and you do need to then go in and have it restrung somewhat frequently. So a few more details about synthetic gut, some things to be aware of. If you demo rackets, odds are there is a synthetic gut in that racket. So once you find the racket you like and then you purchase it, and whoever you purchase the racket from says, hey, maybe you should try this multi-filament, it's a bit more durable. You're like, all right, I'll go along with that. This happens all the time. People then buy the racket, something they've demoed, and they go, this isn't the same racket. I absolutely hate the feel of this. And that has to do with the string. So in many ways, string is actually more important than the frame itself. You don't need to upgrade to the newest version of the Aero Pro or the Aero Pure drive just because they've released a new model. The differences are very small, but the differences between a polyester and a synthetic gut are huge. And so for a lot of players, it actually makes sense if they've demoed a racket, they really love the feel of it, to stick with and continue with synthetic gut. But of course you have to restring more. So if you were to put in that multi-filament, maybe you get away with 2 months as compared to 1, and then maybe that can save you money. So even calling this string budget string, I think is a little bit iffy if you are restringing as frequently as you should be, which For the most part, people actually don't do that. So it can be a budget string. If you're not a string breaker, you kind of have a little more of a compact swing. I've gotten synthetic gut from people, they haven't strung it in a year, and it's like hitting a trampoline off of it. Never a good thing. You don't want to get to that point. And as we go through further in this video, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So specifically with Babolat Synthetic Gut, this is the 16 gauge variety, and it is manufactured in Taiwan. For a lot of people, knowing where the string is manufactured makes a big difference on the string that they purchase. A lot of strings are manufactured in Taiwan, especially for companies, their lower tier of strings like their synthetic gut, they'll outsource that to a place like China or Taiwan. And then their higher level strings, they actually manufacture closer to home. So something like RPM Blast is actually manufactured in France, and part of that explains why it's 3 or 4 times as expensive. So what sort of players should use synthetic gut? Well, it really depends. I think any sort of player can actually use it. If you're a really aggressive baseliner, if you're like a 4-0, 4-5, and you play from the back, you have a very modern swing, maybe you have like a Rafa follow through, synthetic gut's gonna break down on you really quick, and you might have a tough time controlling the ball even in the duration of a match. That's kind of where things get a little bit tricky. If it would stay consistent over a 3-hour span of you playing at full tilt, it's not a bad string to use, to be honest, but odds of that happening are very low. It will wear down, it will break, or the tension will drop at a really quick rate, and so it becomes kind of unusable. But I think for everybody else, you can use synthetic gut. You're a doubles player, you hit a lot of volleys, you're looking to come in, serve, and we'll get to this in the playtest. Serve feels really good with synthetic gut. If you have more of a compact swing, this will help you get some depth on the ball just naturally. It's more of like a power string, just meaning that you don't have to supply the power as you would with like a polyester. If you just go like this with a polyester, the ball's probably not getting to the net. If you just do this with a synthetic gut, you can actually get it to be pretty deep, go past the service line, whatever. So I think for a lot of players, synthetic gut actually makes a lot of sense. It's a good all-around string. Volleys, at least with this string specifically, a little bit iffy. We'll get more into that later. But really, I think for the most part, almost anybody can use synthetic gut, and almost everyone has used it. It's been on their demo racket, or it's on the racket that you buy off the shelf. And so just because the string is more expensive doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be better or worse. In the case of synthetic gut, it just means that you probably have to restring a bit more frequently. So we can get into the actual play test. This is the racket that has the synthetic gut in it, strung at 58 pounds. And a common complaint with Babolat Synthetic Gut that I read online is that the string moves around a lot. By looking at this, we have some movement, but not too much, nothing drastic to a point where between every single play, I have to go in and adjust it. Now, granted, I wasn't playing at full tilt with it for more than maybe 30 or 45 minutes, and if I did, I would imagine that I'd see a bit more movement in here. But for the most part, I didn't have that issue. I think with any synthetic gut, with a string pattern that's a bit more open, meaning that there's more space with these squares, or you have a larger racket head, you could probably get a lot of movement with this string. That wasn't an issue that I actually had too much of. And if you string looser, I could see that being a problem and becoming very annoying. But for me, not really a problem. In fact, I find that TNT moves around a little bit more. But of course, some of that may have to do with the amount of time that you actually have the string in there. In terms of playing, I was pleasantly surprised with the feel. And the first thing you notice is the sound that this makes on ground strokes. It is a really crisp, nice sort of popping sound, and that may have to do with whatever the material is that they coat this in. Really, really like that. And to be honest, I haven't played with a racket with full-on synthetic gut in like 10 years. So it was just remarkable to me that I actually could go to the baseline, take my normal swing, and the ball is still going in. But now comes the downsides. Within about an hour, 2 hours, the second or third time I went out with this racket, now the ball is kind of flying long. It doesn't feel as good, and especially on volleys. At the beginning, I was able to kind of control them, keep them in, but as time was going on, they were all flying long, and I had to really kind of stick them and emphasize going down. Of course, before I was using a polyester. I think what was in this before was RPM blast probably. And so the feel was very different, but I didn't have to really make that effort to volley down. And if I was going for drop volleys with this, you really have to come in and cut under it. All right, if you're going to try to generate the amount of spin that you need to generate. So overall, I probably played with this for about 2 to 3 hours, but only 30 to 40 minutes of really hitting. And what you can see, and I'm going to try to look closely so I can show you this, is that we are starting to get a decent amount of wear down. And I'm not sure if you'll actually be able to see this, but if you have something with synthetic gut, you can look and you start to see that the color goes from white to almost a black. And then the other test is if I feel on the outside where I'm not making contact with the ball, very silky, very smooth, that outer coating still there, still intact. As I get closer and I start to feel along these burn marks, the material, it's wearing down. The coating is gone. And in fact, I was probably 10 to 15 minutes away from a break. And I will update the post when it does break and kind of tell you and show you maybe where it broke for me. Tension, it was in there at 58. It's definitely down. Not as much as I thought it was going to be, though. I thought that, the second time I bring it out, like it's going to feel like a trampoline. That's not the case. So it's retained tension pretty well thus far. But again, I imagine that it's going to break. So the biggest positive I noticed from this string, and some of this has to do with teaching, but for playing, is serve. Serve feels so good off of synthetic gut compared to a full bed of polyester. You have no idea. I don't really have arm problems, and the arm problems I've had in the past have been with a full bed of poly. So for me, putting in synthetic gut, I didn't feel any pain. I didn't have any issues with it. I also had a player who's about 3.0 to 3.5. She tried out this racket with the strings and also didn't feel any kind of arm pain, really preferred it actually to TNT, but some of that has to do with the fresh restring. You always are going to prefer the feeling of brand new strings, and she definitely liked the feeling of it and may actually be switching to synthetic gut and then just stringing a bit more frequently with it. So the last thing I'll just kind of inform you of is for teaching purposes, I really like this, and it's for a couple of reasons. Some of it has to do with the inherent power in the string. So if I'm hitting with somebody who's like a 3.0 or a 3.5, they can't really handle too much of the top spin. First of all, this is not a string-heavy string. So you can get a decent amount of top spin, more than you'd think that you'd be able to get. But over time, you're going to end up breaking the strings pretty quick. And it's not going to lurch or jump the way strings like, like a Luxilon or strings that are designed to do that will do. And what I like is then I could be at the baseline, compact the stroke in a little bit, and with a polyester, the control, and this is so funny because these words get used in different ways, the control isn't particularly good. It's difficult for me to consistently put it 2 or 3 feet behind the service line so that it sets up for them in a good place to hit. With synthetic gut, absolutely great. I can just kind of compactly go like this from the back, and I can get the depth that I want on the ball. I can really kind of control where I want it to go with that shorter swing, whereas polyester, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to do that. So final thoughts about this string. Personally, pleasantly surprised with it. But the reality is you are going to have to restring on a fairly regular basis. And so let's maybe break down some recommendations for that, whether you're using Babolat Synthetic Gut or any synthetic gut. If you just do a clinic once a week, right, for maybe 2 hours, I would recommend a month and a half probably before you want to restring. And that's just so that you don't start compensating. This really is very little to do with money. And I mean, obviously you have to factor in cost, but I'm trying to tell you from what I think would make the most sense, cost versus benefit. Probably every 6 weeks or something like that, because eventually what you're going to do with the tension dropping so much is you're going to start changing your stroke, and that's not what you want. You don't want to start compensating. You may not even realize you're doing it, but you will start to compensate because the ball's flying long, more of a trampoline effect, whatever. If you play on a regular basis 2 or 3 times a week, probably every month you're going to want to have this restrung. If you play with more topspin, you're probably going to break the string, so you'll be changing based on breaks. But this is not a string that you can leave in no matter who you are for 4 to 6 months and expect good playability on it. It's just not going to happen. So that is going to pretty much do it for my review and playthrough on Babolat Synthetic Gut. If you have specific questions, you can leave them in the comments or you can contact me by email. Whatever you want to do, whatever is easiest for you. So thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you're getting out there and playing, because that's what it's all about. Take care.